In front of more than 400 guests, Audrey Sinclair raised her glass and pointed to the man in the worn coat standing at the back of the hall. Take a good look. More than a decade in the same chair, and still nothing. Some people are born ordinary. The room laughed. She snapped her fingers for security and had him walked out of her sight. Caleb Harrison never argued. He unclipped his badge, set it on the table, and turned for the doors. But the moment his hand touched the handle, the chair of the board stepped onto the stage, and the first words out of her mouth killed the laughter and made Audrey Sinclair drop her glass. The Orion Dynamics Tower opened at 7 each morning, and Caleb Harrison was usually through the doors by 10 past. He took the service elevator instead of the main bank, because the main bank was full of people talking loudly about their weekends, and the badge clipped to his coat read, Internal Controls. Floor 11, a department nobody visited, unless something had already gone wrong, and by then nobody cared who worked there. He liked that. The invisibility was not an accident. It was the entire design. The company was 11 years old. It had started in a rented unit behind a machine shop with 3 engineers, a whiteboard, and a contract Caleb signed personally because there was no company yet to sign it. He built the first control system himself, sold it himself, and slept in that unit through most of the first winter, because the heating bill for an apartment was money the payroll needed more. By year 4, there were 200 employees. By year 9, there were offices in 3 states, and a valuation large enough that the trade press started printing his name. That was when he stopped enjoying any of it. People had stopped telling him the truth. Meetings ended in agreement he had not asked for. Engineers softened bad news before it climbed to his floor, and problems arrived on his desk already wrapped in an explanation. A company that agrees with its founder about everything is a company that has stopped seeing its own faults. He wanted to know what Orion Dynamics looked like when he was not watching, and more than that, what it did to the people inside it who had no leverage at all. So 2 years ago, he stepped down as chief executive, kept his controlling stake, and handed the operation to Audrey Sinclair. She had been the youngest division head in the company's history, and she had earned it. She could read a balance sheet the way most people read a headline, and she had a talent for making a room move in the direction she wanted. She was 34 when she took the chair, and the announcement ran on business channels for 2 days. The arrangement had exactly one other party. Margaret Holloway had sat on the board since year 3, and she was the only person in the building who knew who Caleb actually was. His personnel file said 11 years of service, which was true, and no promotions, which was also true in its own way. His salary was modest and real. His performance reviews were written by a manager he reported to on paper, a man who had no idea he was scoring the person who owned the company. Margaret had built the cover herself, and she had told him once that she thought it was a mistake. "You'll learn things you can't unlearn," she said in a parking garage, because that was where they met now. "And you won't be able to fix them without giving yourself away." He told her that was the point. For 2 years it worked. He sat under fluorescent light behind gray partitions, checking approval chains, expense categories, vendor registrations. He learned the names of the people who cleaned his floor. He learned which managers screamed at their teams and which ones took the blame themselves. He learned that the company he built was better than he feared in some places and worse in others, and he wrote none of it down because a notebook is evidence, and evidence has to be earned. He also left the building at 6 every evening without exception. He was a widower and a single father, and 6 o'clock was the one line in his life he had never moved. Not for a client. Not for a quarter. Not for anyone. He did not travel. He did not take the late calls. He never came to the drinks after the quarterly meetings, and he never explained why. Because an explanation invites follow-up questions, and follow-up questions are how covers come apart. What the 11th floor knew was simple. Harrison went home at 6. He drove a 14-year-old sedan that he parked at the far end of the lot. He had never once asked anyone for a promotion. That was enough for the building to draw its own conclusion. On an executive floor, a man who leaves at 6 is a man without ambition, and a man without ambition is a man without a ceiling worth measuring. Nobody was cruel about it. They simply stopped seeing him, which in a company that size amounted to the same thing. Audrey Sinclair made the calculation faster than most. She noticed him for the first time in her second month when he carried a compliance sheet up to the executive floor because the internal mail system had gone down. She glanced at the badge, then at the coat, then back at her document, and thanked him without looking up again. He remembered it clearly. It had not offended him. It had told him something. She was not a bad executive. That was the part outsiders never understood afterward. She hit every number the board gave her, cut a bloated procurement process down to something functional, and defended her people in front of clients. But somewhere in her second year, the chair began doing what chairs do. She started sorting the world by the letters after a name, and once a person had been sorted, she never opened the file again. Her time was expensive. Everyone told her so. Eventually, she believed it enough to build a rule out of it. The people worth listening to were the people already at the table. Caleb watched it happen the way you watch weather build on a horizon. He had put her in that chair. Whatever she was becoming, he had a hand in it. The first thing that did not fit was a supplier nobody could describe. In the second week of a routine control review, Caleb pulled the vendor ledger for the Industrial Systems Division and found a company called Meridian Logistics Partners. 6 invoices across 9 months, $280,000 in total, every one of them sized just below the amount that would have required a second signature. The service description on all 6 was identical integration support phase deployment. He had designed the deployment process himself. There was no phase in it that required an outside logistics partner. He requested the vendor registration file through the ordinary channel and received it 4 days later. Meridian had been onboarded with a tax registration, a business address, a bank routing record. Everything was complete, which was itself the problem. In 11 years, Caleb had never seen a vendor file with nothing missing. Real companies are sloppy. Only invented ones are perfect. He drove to the address on a Saturday. It was a mail forwarding office in a strip retail block between a dry cleaner and a tax preparer, and the clerk behind the counter told him box 410 had been paid 2 years in advance and had never once been opened by anyone. Over the next 3 weeks, he found 4 more. Different names as different divisions. The same architecture underneath invoice values clustered under the second signature threshold service descriptions vague enough to survive a skim approval chains that all terminated at the same operational sign-off code. The code belonged to the office of the Deputy Chief Executive. Vincent Brooks had been running operations for 2 years before Audrey ever took the top job, and he had been one of the loudest voices in the room arguing that she should have it. He was very good at the visible parts of his work. He remembered names. He remembered birthdays. He walked the floors, which executives are told to do and rarely do, and he stood slightly too close when he praised someone, which made the praise feel like a personal favor. He had also been the one to tell Audrey, during her first difficult quarter, that the board was circling, and then the one who made the problem disappear. She had trusted him ever since, in the specific way people trust anyone who once caught them falling. Caleb ran the totals on a Sunday night at his kitchen table with the printout spread in front of him. Just over $1,400,000 across 19 months. Enough to be a felony. Not enough to prove intent, because every invoice had a legitimate-looking paper trail behind it, and a competent attorney would call the whole thing a procurement failure and blame the system. Then Diane Whitaker came to see him. She worked in the audit group 2 floors down, had 6 years with the company, and had never spoken to him before. She sat on the edge of the chair beside his desk at 10 to 6 on a Thursday, holding her bag on her lap, as though she intended to stand up again immediately. "You pulled the Meridian registration file," she said. You're the only one who has." He told her the file was clean, and that it was the cleanest file he had ever read. "That's because I flagged it in the spring. Twice. The first flag came back closed with a note saying the vendor had been verified by operations. The second one never came back at all. And then my access to the historical vendor tables was reduced. Nobody told me. I found out when a query failed." She set a flash drive on the corner of his desk and did not let go of it right away. She had copied the original approval logs before the access change, because 6 years in that building had taught her that the person who reports a problem becomes the problem. Her name was on nothing. She had a mortgage and no other offers, and if she was wrong about him, she was finished. Caleb asked the only question that mattered. Why him? "Because you go home at 6, she said. "You've never taken a promotion. You don't owe anybody up there anything. Everyone else I could take this to is somebody's person." She left before he could answer. He sat with the drive a long time before he plugged it in. What was on it changed the shape of the thing. Diane's copies held the original approval logs, the versions that showed request timestamps before the sign-off codes were applied. In 4 of the 5 vendor cases, the payment had been authorized and released before the approval was ever logged. Someone had built the paperwork afterward and backdated it into the system to close the loop. A control failure is an accident. This was construction. He worked until 2 in the morning and understood 2 things by the end of it. The first was that Orion Dynamics was being taken apart from the inside patiently by someone who understood exactly how much a company will forgive when the documentation looks correct. The second was that he still could not prove whose hand was on the pen. Every trail ran to the deputy chief executive's sign-off code, and a code is not a man. Vincent Brooks had never touched a single one of those files with his own credentials. Somewhere between the code and the money, there was a person, and until Caleb could put a name and a hand on that person, all he had was a very good story that a very good lawyer would take apart in an afternoon. He considered ending it that week. It would have taken 4 minutes. Call Margaret Walk into the executive conference room, put the drive on the table, say his own name. The company was his. The stake was his. The investigation would have started that afternoon. He didn't, and he made himself be honest about why. Part of it was tactical. If he surfaced now, Vincent would have days to clean the system, and a man who could build a supplier out of nothing could certainly delete one. Whatever vanished in those days would be exactly the material that connected the code to the man. The other part was less comfortable. Caleb had spent 2 years telling himself he was down there to learn what the company did to people with no power. He had learned it. He was still learning it. And some quiet, unattractive corner of him wanted to see how far it would run, how long a man could be dismissed for a coat and a departure time before one person in that building stopped and asked a single, real question. So he stayed where he was and tried it the ordinary way. He requested a meeting with the chief executive's office through the standard system and received a response 9 days later, offering him 12 minutes. When he arrived, Audrey Sinclair had 2 documents open and a call waiting. He did not use the word fraud because a compliance reviewer accusing the deputy chief executive without a complete chain would have been escorted out that afternoon. He told her that 5 vendors in the operations approval line showed structural irregularities, that the invoice values clustered suspiciously beneath the second signature threshold, and that she should hold the next round of operational authorizations for a full review before signing. She listened to most of it. That was the part he kept turning over afterward. She did listen at first. "Have you raised this with operations?" she asked. He told her operations owned the sign-off code in question. Audrey wrote something on a pad, and for about 4 seconds, the meeting could have gone the other way. Then she looked at the badge on his coat, and he watched the sorting happen behind her eyes, and he knew precisely what conclusion she reached, because it was the one the whole building reached, and the one his cover had been built to produce. Mr. Harrison. "I appreciate diligence," she said. "But if the process has a flaw, it goes through your director, then operations, then me. That's the chain. And I'd be careful about attaching an executive sign-off code to the word irregular in a room you weren't invited to." He said evenly that the chain was the thing he was warning her about because every link in it reported to the office he wanted reviewed. She stood, which ended the meeting. "I'll have someone look at it," she said. And he understood that the someone would be operations, and that operations would be told exactly who had asked. He tried twice more over the following 6 weeks. The second attempt was a written memo, 4 pages. No accusations, only the pattern, and a recommendation to suspend authorizations pending an independent review. It came back with a reply drafted by the operations office and approved by the chief executive. The matter had been reviewed. The vendors were verified. The reviewer was reminded to observe escalation protocol. The third was in a corridor outside the 22nd floor conference room, which he knew was a mistake before he opened his mouth. She was walking between meetings with 2 directors beside her. He said only that the authorization package she was signing that week contained 2 of the vendors from his memo, and that she should read the payment timestamps before she signed it. Audrey stopped and looked at him with something worse than anger. It was a tired patience, the kind people use on someone who has become a recurring small problem. "Do you know how many people in this building want my attention this week?" she said. "Ambition is fine. This isn't how you get it. Go back to 11 and do your job." One of the directors laughed. She walked on. She signed the package on Friday. Caleb went back to his desk and did the arithmetic without any feeling in it at all. Every path that ran upward through the company ran through either Vincent Brooks or a chief executive who had now dismissed him 3 times on the record, and that record, he understood, would eventually be turned around and used against him. Which left one way out: build the entire thing himself, every link, until it was so complete that no attorney and no signature and no title could take it apart. He was going to have to become the problem before he could solve it. The counterattack came faster than he expected, and it did not come at him first. Diane Whitaker was called into a meeting on a Tuesday morning with 2 people from operations and 1 from human resources. On the table was an audit worksheet carrying her credentials, in which 3 vendor verifications had been marked, complete with supporting documents that did not exist. The file had been created 6 days earlier by someone who knew exactly which fields the system stamped automatically and which ones a person could type by hand. She told them the truth, which was that on the date shown, her access to the vendor tables had already been reduced, and she could not have opened those records at all. The woman from Human Resources wrote it down. Nobody checked it. The termination letter used the phrase falsification of internal audit records, and by 4 o'clock, her badge was deactivated, and a security escort walked her through the lobby with a box in her hands, past 2 floors of people who watched and understood the lesson perfectly. Caleb heard about it at 4:05 from a man at the copier told his gossip. He went back to his desk and sat without moving for a while because he had allowed it. She had come to him at 10 to 6 on a Thursday and told him she had a mortgage and no other offers, and he had taken her drive and let her walk out of the building alone. 3 days later, the system came for him. It began with a routine access reconciliation, the kind internal controls ran on itself once a quarter. Caleb pulled his own audit trail out of habit and found something that had not been there in the spring. The Meridian registration file, the perfect one, the one with nothing missing, now carried a secondary verification entry. The entry bore his user identification, his floor, his department code, and a timestamp from months before he had ever heard the name Meridian. He checked the others. 3 of the 4 had grown the same entry. Whoever built it had been careful about the story it told. Caleb had not been made the author of the fraud. He had been made its quiet enabler, the compliance reviewer, who signed off on 4 fictitious suppliers, and who then, once the pattern began surfacing, started sending memos upstairs to look like the man who discovered it. That was better than a simple frame. It explained his memos. It turned every warning he had given into evidence of a guilty man building his own alibi. He understood then how thoroughly he had been read. Vincent Brooks had never needed to know who Caleb really was. He had only needed to know what the building believed about him, and a man that nobody has ever looked at closely is the easiest kind to hang something on, because nobody has any reason to be surprised. The report reached the 22nd floor within the week. Caleb never saw it, but he learned its shape from what followed. His director stopped assigning him live files. His request for the historical payment archive was declined without a reason. On a Thursday afternoon, a woman from operations came down to collect his working papers on the vendor review, and she was polite about it in the way people are polite when they have been told they are dealing with a problem. Audrey Sinclair read the report and reached the only conclusion the report allowed, because Vincent had built it that way. The memos, the corridor, the 12 minutes in her office, all of it now had a motive attached, and the motive was self-preservation. She said as much in an executive session, and Margaret Holloway repeated the line to Caleb word for word in the parking garage. The company had a compliance reviewer who had spent 11 years going nowhere and had apparently decided the fastest way up was to manufacture a crisis and then volunteer to solve it. Vincent came down to internal controls himself. That was the mistake, and it was a mistake made out of contempt. He arrived at 20 to 6 on a Wednesday when the floor was nearly empty and sat on the edge of the desk the way he did when he was being personal. He asked how long Caleb had been with the company. He said 11 years was a long time in one seat. He said he had reviewed the situation himself and that there was a version of it where nobody's career ended, and another version. Caleb's phone was in his shirt pocket recording and had been since the elevator doors opened. What Vincent said over the next 10 minutes was never quite a confession, but it did not need to be. He said the vendor entries had been corrected and that further inquiries into the operations approval line would be treated as a security matter. He said Diane Whitaker had made her own choices and that Caleb should think carefully about whether he wanted to make the same ones. Then, because he believed he was talking to furniture, he added the sentence that ended him that the packages had been signed by the chief executive herself, every one of them, and that if anybody ever went digging, the signature at the bottom would not be his. He left at 10 to 6. Caleb sat with the recording and understood that Vincent had just told him where the last piece was. The live system had been rewritten, but Caleb had built the system. In the second year of the company, when Orion Dynamics had one product and no money, he had set up an off-site archive that wrote a full snapshot of the financial tables to physical media every 90 days and shipped it to a storage facility outside the city. It was obsolete. It had been superseded twice. It had also never been decommissioned because nobody who arrived after year 4 knew it existed. And the line item sat in facilities under a maintenance code for $420 a quarter. That was the flaw in Vincent's arrogance. He had released every payment from the terminal in his own office because he was certain the only records that existed were the ones he could reach and rewrite. And he had spent 19 months being right about that. Caleb drove out on a Saturday and signed for the media under the account name that had been on the contract since the beginning, his own, on a company that had been folded into Orion Dynamics 9 years earlier. It took 2 nights to read. The snapshots held the vendor tables as they had existed before anyone touched them. In the original records, there was no secondary verification from internal controls on the Meridian file or on any of the others. There were the original payment timestamps matching Diane's copies exactly. And there was the one thing she had never been able to reach, the release records, showing which workstation had initiated each of the 23 payments. All 23 came from the same terminal. The terminal was assigned to the office of the Deputy Chief Executive. That was the hand. That was the thing standing between the code and the man. He had all of it now, And it was that same night, working through the authorization packages, that the other half of the picture arrived and turned out to be worse. Audrey Sinclair's signature was on 4 of them, not forged hers, applied through her own credentials on 4 consolidated operational packages that together released more than $800,000 to companies that did not exist. 2 had been signed after the 12-minute meeting. 1 had been signed on the Friday after the corridor. He sat with that a long time. She had not stolen anything. He was certain of it within an hour and more certain by morning. There was no account, no benefit, no pattern that led anywhere near her. What she had done was worse, in a way that would be harder for her to survive. She had signed 31 operational packages that quarter without opening a single underlying schedule, because operations had verified them, and operations was Vincent, and Vincent was the man who had caught her when she was falling. Every protection a company builds comes down in the end to one person willing to read something boring. She had stopped being that person somewhere in her 2nd year, and she had stopped for a reason that had nothing to do with money. She had decided her attention was the most expensive thing in the building and should be spent only on people who already held a title. So when the warning finally came, it came from a compliance reviewer with a worn coat and no rank, and it went into the same bin as the coat. That was the sentence Caleb kept turning over. Vincent had not defeated the company's controls. He had stood behind a woman who had stopped looking at anyone below her, and he had used her as a wall. He made the decision that night, and he made it coldly. He would not take it to her office. He would not hand it to the board in a closed room, where it could quietly become a settlement, a resignation with a package, a press line about restructuring. Vincent Brooks had built the entire scheme on the certainty that nobody would ever check the paperwork in front of witnesses. The annual gala was 5 weeks away. Every board member would be there, every senior executive, more than 400 guests, clients and press among them. One night a year, the company assembled itself in a single room and looked at itself. That was where he would open it. Vincent moved first and moved publicly. Within 10 days, a version of events had reached every floor. A compliance reviewer had removed confidential financial records from the building without authorization. Legal was involved. The matter was being handled. Nobody put the name in an email. They set it in corridors, which travels faster and cannot be retrieved. Ray Douglas from corporate security opened a file. He was a careful man, and he was not part of any of it. He requested badge history archive requests, terminal logs, and he found what Vincent had prepared him to find: a series of queries into payment tables that had been reclassified as restricted 2 weeks after Caleb ran them. The reclassification date was the detail that would have cleared him, and Ray Douglas noticed it and put a note in the file. The note went to operations, where it stopped. Caleb let all of it happen. He never defended himself once, and the absence of a defense was read by the entire building as an admission. He kept arriving at 7:10. He kept leaving at 6. Twice he was asked to hand over materials, and twice he handed over exactly what was requested, because everything that mattered had been copied 3 times, and none of the copies were in the building. Upstairs, something else was happening that Audrey Sinclair misread completely. Margaret Holloway had begun requesting documents through the board's own channel: 19 months of operational authorizations, the vendor registry, the reconciliation reports, the terminal assignment schedule. She requested them, formally in writing, copied to the corporate secretary, which made them impossible to refuse and impossible to bury. Arthur Kellerman, who chaired the audit committee, filed a second request 4 days later. A firm of outside investigators was retained under a board mandate, and the engagement letter never passed through the chief executive's office. Audrey saw a board circling. She had felt it once before, and the man who had made it go away then was sitting across from her, now saying the same thing again, that the board forgives numbers, but never a leader who cannot control her own building, and that there was a story going around about a compliance reviewer walking out with company records while nobody did anything about it. Vincent framed it as counsel. He suggested the matter be resolved visibly before the board resolved it for her. They need to see that you handle things, he told her, not that you process them. She agreed. It was the last decision she would ever make as chief executive, and she made it believing she was protecting the company. Margaret met Caleb in the parking garage 9 days before the gala. The outside investigators had confirmed the terminal records independently. The board had the complete package. She could convene an emergency session inside 48 hours and end it in a closed room. Caleb told her no. If they took it into a boardroom, he said Vincent would resign before the first document was read, and the company would announce a departure and a strengthening of internal controls, and inside 18 months, he would be running someone else's operations division with a reference letter in his file. Margaret asked whether that was the real reason. He said the rest of it out loud once, because she was the only person he could say it to. He wanted to see how far it went. He had spent 2 years learning what this company did to people with no leverage, and now he was going to find the bottom. "You already know where the bottom is," she said. "You're just making them show you." 2 days before the gala, a memorandum from the chief executive's office instructed corporate security to have a representative present in the ballroom for the duration of the event. Ray Douglas read it twice and did not understand why. He put on a dark suit and went anyway. The ballroom held 412 people that night. Caleb came in the same gray coat. He had been sent an invitation every year because the guest list was generated from the payroll system, and nobody had ever revised it, and he had attended exactly twice in 11 years. He stood at the back, near the doors, beside a table of people from facilities and building services who were the only ones in the room who said hello to him. Vincent worked the floor for the first hour, remembering names, remembering birthdays. Around 9 o'clock, he leaned in beside Audrey Sinclair and said something brief, and she looked toward the back of the room, and Caleb watched her find him. She took the microphone at 9:20 to deliver the remarks she had prepared about the year, and she delivered most of them. Then she set the notes down. "There's someone here tonight who's been with this company almost since the beginning," she said. And the room turned. "Take a good look. More than a decade in the same chair, and still nothing. No ambition, no record, nothing anyone here could name. Some people are born ordinary. They make peace with it. And then, one day, they decide the reason they never rose is that somebody else took something from them." The laughter started at the front tables where the people sat, who understood that laughing was the correct response, and it moved backward through the room like a current. "I built this company's leadership out of the opposite of that," she went on. "And I don't think a man under review for removing confidential records belongs in a room full of our clients." She snapped her fingers toward Ray Douglas at the side of the room. He crossed the floor because he had been ordered to, and his face said clearly that he wanted no part of it. Caleb said nothing. He reached up, unclipped the badge from his coat, and set it down flat on the table in front of him. Then he turned and walked toward the doors with 400 people watching him go, and his hand came to rest on the handle. His hand never turned it. A voice came through the ballroom speakers behind him, and it was not Audrey Sinclair's. Margaret Holloway had taken the second microphone from the table beside the stage, and what she said into it was 4 words. "Mr. Harrison, please stay spoken by the chair of the board in a tone nobody in that room had ever heard her use for an employee." The laughter did not fade. It stopped all at once, the way a sound stops when a door closes on it. Audrey turned toward the stage, and something in Margaret's face finished the sentence for her. The glass came apart on the floor beside her shoe. She did not appear to notice it. Behind Margaret, the board was already moving. Arthur Kellerman came up the side steps with a folder under his arm, and 2 directors followed him. A man in a plain suit who had not been on the guest list stood up from a table near the doors and stayed standing, and beside him, a woman in a dark coat took out a phone and put it to her ear without hurrying about it. For the past 2 years, Margaret said, this company has been run by a chief executive, appointed by its founder and controlling shareholder. Some of you have wondered why he stepped back. None of you ever wondered where he went, because he told exactly one person in this building, and that person was me. The room was making the low sound a crowd makes when it has stopped understanding something. He has been on the 11th floor, internal controls, 11 years of service, no promotions. He asked for it that way. She turned toward the doors then, and the lights turned with her, and 400 faces followed the beam to the man standing with his hand on the handle. Ladies and gentlemen, the founder of Orion Dynamics, the holder of a controlling interest in this company, and the man this room laughed at 90 seconds ago. Caleb Harrison. Somebody at a front table dropped a fork onto a plate, and in the silence it sounded enormous. Caleb let go of the handle. He did not walk to the stage in triumph, because that was not what any of this was for. He crossed the floor at an ordinary pace, and the crowd opened for him the way it had never opened for him in 11 years, and he stopped at the foot of the steps without climbing them. "Finish it," he told Margaret. The screens behind the stage had been showing the company logo all evening. Arthur Kellerman opened his folder, nodded to a technician at the side of the room, and the logo went away. The first document was the Meridian Logistics Partners registration file, complete perfect with nothing missing. Beside it, a photograph of a mail forwarding office between a dry cleaner and a tax preparer, and a signed statement from the clerk confirming that Box 410 had been paid 2 years in advance and had never once been opened. The second screen put 5 vendor names in a column with their totals beside them. 19 months, 23 payments, $1,400,000, none of it ever attached to a service anyone in that building could name. The third screen ended it. On the left, the payment release records. On the right, a single line from the terminal assignment schedule. Every release had been initiated from the same workstation, and the workstation belonged to the office of the deputy chief executive. Then Margaret played the recording. Vincent Brooks's own voice went out over the speakers to 412 people telling a man he considered furniture that the vendor entries had been corrected, that further inquiries would be treated as a security matter, that Diane Whitaker had made her own choices. And at the end, the sentence he had spent 19 months making certain he would be able to say, that every one of those packages had been signed by the chief executive herself, and that if anybody ever went digging, the signature at the bottom would not be his. Nobody moved. Vincent stood up at table 3. That was his second mistake, and it was made of the same material as the first, because he had never in his life been in a room he could not talk his way across. "That recording is edited," he said loudly. And then he did not wait for an answer, because he had already understood that the terminal schedule behind him was not the kind of thing a man argues with. So he turned in front of everybody and pointed at Audrey Sinclair. She signed them, every package, 31 in a single quarter, and she never opened one schedule because she was too important to read her own authorizations. I told her the vendors were verified, and she never asked me a question. Not one in 19 months. If you want the person who let this happen, she's standing right there. It was the most honest thing he had ever said inside that building, and he said it only to save himself, and everyone in the room understood both of those things at the same moment. Audrey did not defend herself. She stood in the broken glass with her hands at her sides, and let it be said because the arithmetic in it was correct. Ray Douglas, who had been sent across that floor 20 minutes earlier to remove a man in a worn coat, walked back the other way and stopped beside table 3 and stayed there. The board did not adjourn to a private room. That had been the entire point, and Margaret had agreed to it 9 days earlier in a parking garage. Arthur Kellerman moved for the immediate removal of Vincent Brooks from the office of Deputy Chief Executive and from every position he held in Orion Dynamics and its subsidiaries. The vote was taken on the stage. It carried without a single vote against, and it took under 2 minutes, and it was the first time in the company's history that a senior officer had been terminated in front of 400 witnesses. The man in the plain suit came up the center aisle, then the woman in the dark coat behind him. They had been retained under a board mandate that never passed through the chief executive's office, and they had been sitting at that table since 8 o'clock, with the complete package already in hand, the original vendor tables from the off-site archive, the preserved approval logs, the terminal records confirmed independently, and now a recording made in a nearly empty office at 20 to 6 on a Wednesday. Vincent Brooks was taken out through the service corridor, rather than the ballroom doors, which was a courtesy nobody had extended to Diane Whitaker. Margaret was still holding the microphone. "One more item, and then you can all go home and talk about this which you will." The screen behind her changed to a termination letter, carrying the phrase falsification of internal audit records. In the spring, an auditor in this company flagged the Meridian file. Twice. The first flag was closed by operations. The second was never answered, and her access to the historical tables was cut without notice. 2 months ago, she was terminated on the basis of a worksheet created 6 days before her dismissal, using her credentials on a date when she no longer had the access required to open those records. Our investigators confirmed that in under an hour. Nobody in this building spent that hour. The letter came off the screen. "The board has rescinded that termination in full with back pay and a written correction to her record. Effective Monday, Diane Whitaker will lead an independent audit function reporting to the audit committee of this board and to no one in the executive line. Not to the chief executive. Not to operations. To us." Diane was not in the room. She had not been invited because the guest list was generated from the payroll system, and she had been removed from it when they walked her out. She found out just before midnight when Arthur Kellerman called her at home, and she made him repeat the part about the reporting line twice before she believed it. The ballroom emptied slowly and badly. People collected coats and did not know how to say goodbye to each other. The press tables left last and left last on purpose. Audrey Sinclair found him near the doors beside the table where the badge still lay face up where he had set it down. "I don't know how to start this," she said. Caleb picked it up and turned it over in his hand. Internal controls. "Floor 11. I want to apologize. For tonight in the memo in the corridor, I didn't know who you were. If I had known who you were, I would have—" "I know," he said. "That's the part I'd like you to sit with." She stopped. "You're not apologizing for what you did. You're apologizing for who it turned out I was. Those aren't the same thing, and the difference is the entire reason your company lost $1,400,000. He set the badge back down. If the man on the 11th floor had actually been what you thought he was, no title, no ambition, home at 6, everything you did tonight would still have been wrong, and the money would still be gone, because Vincent never beat our controls. He stood behind a chief executive who had stopped looking at anyone below her, and he used you as a wall. He said so himself on that recording, and he was right." Audrey's voice came out level, which cost her something. "I signed them." "You did. 31 packages in 1/4 4 of them for companies that don't exist more than $800,000. You didn't steal a dollar, and I confirmed that before I confirmed anything else." He looked at her directly for the first time all evening. "But 2 of those signatures came after you sat across a desk from me for 12 minutes, and 1 came on the Friday after I stood in a corridor and told you to read the payment timestamps. You didn't ignore a warning because it was wrong. You ignored it because of the coat. Then why not tell me?" she said. 2 years. 1 sentence, and none of this happens. Because 1 sentence from an owner isn't information, it's an order. I already knew what this company sounded like when it agreed with me. I wanted to know what it did to someone who couldn't make it agree. He put his hands in his pockets. Now I know. So do the 400 people who laughed. She asked what happened to her now. He told her that was a matter for the board, that it would be handled properly, and in writing, and that whatever they decided, he was not going to stand in a room full of broken glass and pretend to forgive her tonight, just so the two of them could feel better walking to the parking lot. Caleb Harrison returned as chief executive of Orion Dynamics the following Monday, in the same coat, and the 11th floor was the first place he went. The reforms took 10 months, and most of them were boring, which was the point. The second signature threshold was abolished and replaced with a rule that no authorization could be released unless the person signing it had opened the underlying schedule logged and time-stamped. The independent audit function under Diane Whitaker was given a budget the executive line could not touch, and a mandate to publish its findings to the board unedited. Any employee who raised a concern in writing received a written answer with a name on it, and the answer was tracked until it closed. He kept one thing from the 2 years downstairs and made it policy. Every senior officer, including him, spends 4 weeks a year working inside a function 3 levels below their own badge and all. Not to inspect it, to be treated the way that job gets treated. Audrey Sinclair resigned 2 weeks after the gala. She was not prosecuted, and she was not blamed for the theft because she had taken nothing, and the board's public statement said exactly that. What it also said at her insistence was that the failure of oversight was hers, that she had signed what she had not read and dismissed a warning because of who delivered it. Nobody made her add the second half. She wrote it herself in her own hand, and Margaret Holloway kept the draft. The last thing she did before clearing her office was request the personnel file of a compliance reviewer with 11 years of service and no promotions, and read every page of it, which took 40 minutes, and which no one had ever done before. A title can make people afraid of you. Only character makes them respect you. Never measure a person by their position, their appearance, or the circumstances you happen to find them in, because what a person is worth has never once been visible from the outside.